Trash doesn't belong at my table. The words didn't echo. They landed, heavy and deliberate, like something practiced, something said before. The soft clink of crystal glasses stuttered, then stopped. A fork hovered midair. Even the low hum of jazz slipping through the ceiling speakers seemed to hesitate, unsure whether to continue or disappear entirely. At the center of it all stood Ethan Caldwell, a man whose name carried weight in rooms far more powerful than this one. A man who built a billion-dollar empire before most people figured out their second career. His suit was charcoal, tailored to the inch, his watch understated, but worth more than a year's salary for anyone in the room who dared to look at it long enough. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Power, when it's real, doesn't shout. Across from him stood Naomi Brooks, dressed in a simple black uniform, apron tied neatly, posture straight, her presence quiet but not small. She didn't flinch, not when the word hit, not when a few guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, pretending to be fascinated by their wine. Not even when Ethan casually reached for his glass again, as if he had just commented on the weather instead of a human being. Naomi moved with the same precision she had all night, refilling a glass at the adjacent table, her hands steady, her expression unreadable. But her eyes saw everything. She saw the couple on the left exchange a glance they quickly buried. She saw the manager frozen near the bar, calculating risk versus reputation. She saw Ethan's reflection in the polished surface of the marble table, relaxed, confident, certain he owned not just the room, but the narrative inside it. And maybe, until this moment, he did. The restaurant itself was the kind of place people waited months to get into, perched 20 floors above downtown Manhattan, where the skyline stretched endlessly through floor-to-ceiling glass, and every table felt like a stage. The lighting was soft, intentional, designed to flatter and conceal at the same time. Conversations here weren't just conversations. They were negotiations, alliances, quiet power plays disguised as dinner. And tonight, Ethan Caldwell was here to close a deal rumored to be worth over $200 million, a deal that would expand his company's reach into markets no one else had touched yet. He leaned back slightly in his chair, glancing at his associates, a faint smirk forming as if inviting them to share in the moment. Some people just don't understand their place, he added, not looking at Naomi this time, which somehow made it worse. A few nervous chuckles followed, thin and uncertain, the kind that exist only to avoid conflict. Naomi placed the bottle down gently, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the table before stepping back. She didn't respond. She didn't defend herself. She didn't need to. Because what no one in that room, not the guests, not the staff, and certainly not Ethan Caldwell, understood yet, was that Naomi Brooks wasn't just watching the room. She was measuring it. Every word, every glance, every assumption. And somewhere beneath the quiet rhythm of service, beneath the polished floors and curated elegance, something unseen had already shifted. The illusion of control, so carefully built, so confidently worn, had a crack in it now. Small, invisible, but real. And Naomi, with her calm breath and steady hands, stood right at the center of it, exactly where she intended to be. The night continued to move forward, but not in the way anyone expected. Time did not slow, yet every second seemed to stretch just enough to make the smallest details louder. The soft glow of the city beyond the glass walls shimmered like a silent audience, watching everything unfold without judgment. Inside, the rhythm of the restaurant returned, but it was no longer smooth. It was cautious, measured, like a room that had just learned something it could not unlearn. Naomi stepped into the service corridor, the sounds of the dining room fading slightly behind her, replaced by the quiet efficiency of the kitchen. Stainless steel surfaces gleamed under brighter lights. Plates moved in steady patterns. Orders were called out in calm, controlled voices. It was a different world back here, one that ran on precision, not ego. She placed the empty tray down, her fingers resting on its edge for just a moment longer than necessary. Not because she was shaken, but because she was thinking, calculating. The kind of thinking that did not rush, did not react, but waited for the exact right moment to move. Daniel Reeves appeared at the end of the corridor, his expression tight, his steps quick but careful. He had seen everything, not just the words, but the silence that followed. He stopped a few feet from her, lowering his voice instinctively, as if the walls themselves could carry what he was about to say. "Naomi, are you all right?" The question hung there, simple on the surface, but layered underneath with concern, caution, and something else, awareness. Naomi looked at him, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged. "I am working," she said calmly. No anger, no emotion, just a statement. Daniel nodded once, but it did not ease him, because he knew something most people in that building did not. He knew who she was, or at least he knew enough. Enough to understand that what had just happened was not small, not temporary, not something that would simply disappear with the end of the night. He glanced toward the dining room, then back at her. "He does not know," he said quietly. It was not a question. Naomi reached for another bottle, checking the label with practiced ease before setting it onto her tray. "No," she replied. One word. Controlled. Certain. And then, after the smallest pause, she added, "Not yet." The air shifted again, even here, even away from the guests and the polished tables. Because those two words carried something weightier than any insult that had been spoken earlier. They carried timing. Intent. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand along the back of his neck before stepping aside to let her pass. He did not try to stop her. He did not try to intervene. Because he understood something most managers never had to understand. This was no longer about service. This was about consequence. Naomi stepped back into the dining room, her presence blending seamlessly into the flow once again. But now, there was a difference. Not in how she moved, not in how she carried herself, but in how the room felt when she entered it. It was subtle, like a current running beneath the surface. Invisible, but undeniable. At Ethan's table, the conversation had shifted into specifics. Numbers were being finalized. Terms clarified. One of his associates leaned forward, voice eager, pushing for confirmation. "If we can secure the location and finalize the partnership tonight, we are looking at a rollout within 6 months, maybe less." Ethan nodded, his confidence returning to its usual rhythm, his tone assured. "We will secure it," he said, as if the outcome had already been decided. As if the room, the building, the future of that deal belonged to him. Naomi approached once more, setting the bottle down with the same quiet precision. She poured without being asked this time, her movements smooth, uninterrupted. Ethan glanced at her again, longer this time. Not because he wanted to, but because something about her stillness refused to disappear. "You have been here all night," he said, almost casually, as if making an observation that did not matter. Naomi met his gaze for the first time directly. Not defiant, not submissive, just present. "Yes," she answered. Simple, unapologetic. Ethan studied her for a second longer, then leaned back, dismissing the moment with a slight shake of his head, turning his attention back to the deal. But something had already been set in motion. Because while he spoke about ownership, about acquisition, about control, he was sitting in a place where he understood none of those things. And Naomi Brooks, standing just a few feet away, knew exactly when that truth would become impossible to ignore. The conversation at the table reached that delicate point where confidence begins to sound like certainty, and certainty begins to sound like ownership. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his fingers resting against the edge of the polished table, his voice steady, deliberate. "We are not just investing in the concept," he said, glancing between his associates. "We are acquiring influence over one of the most strategically positioned properties in Manhattan. Location like this does not come around twice." His words carried weight, the kind that made people nod before they fully understood, the kind that filled silence with agreement. Across the table, one of the investors adjusted his glasses, flipping through a folder that had already been reviewed twice. "And the current ownership?" he asked, his tone cautious but curious. "They are willing to negotiate." Ethan allowed himself a small smile, the kind that suggested control without effort. "Everyone is willing," he replied. "It is just a matter of the right number." The statement landed clean, confident, unquestioned. Because in Ethan's world, everything had a price. Everything moved when pushed hard enough. Everything bent eventually. Naomi stood just outside the circle of their conversation, her presence quiet but precise, as if she existed both inside and outside the moment at the same time. She placed a fresh set of glasses onto the table, aligning them carefully, her movements measured down to the inch. She did not interrupt. She did not acknowledge the conversation, but she heard every word. And more importantly, She understood what they meant. Not the surface meaning, not the numbers or projections, but the assumption underneath them. The belief that ownership could be taken simply because someone powerful decided it should be. The belief that places like this existed to be acquired, not respected. At the far end of the room, Daniel Reeves stood near the bar again, his posture rigid, his attention locked onto the table he could not ignore. He had seen negotiations before. He had seen deals made, broken, reshaped over a single glass of wine. But this felt different. Not because of the numbers. Because of the silence that surrounded one person in the room who had not spoken a single unnecessary word all night. Back at the table, the younger associate leaned in again, his energy building with the momentum of the conversation. If we close tonight, we can restructure management within the quarter, he said. New branding, new leadership. We can turn this place into something bigger than it already is. Ethan nodded once, his gaze drifting briefly across the room, taking in the architecture, the lighting, the carefully curated atmosphere. It already is something, he said. We are just going to make it ours. The words were simple, clean, final, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to hold its breath again. Naomi finished placing the last glass and stepped back, her hands folding lightly in front of her. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes had changed. Not in anger, not in defiance, but in clarity, because this was the moment she had been waiting for. Not the insult, not the silence. This, the assumption spoken out loud. The line crossed without hesitation. She turned slightly, her gaze moving toward Daniel for just a fraction of a second. It was not a signal anyone else would notice, but Daniel did. His breath caught, his posture tightening as if he had just stepped into something irreversible. Because in that brief exchange, he understood. This was no longer a possibility. It was about to become a revelation. Naomi reached for the wine bottle one more time, stepping forward with the same quiet precision that had defined her all evening. She poured carefully, evenly, her movements unhurried. The deep red liquid settled into the glass, catching the light, reflecting the room in distorted fragments. Ethan watched it for a moment, then looked up at her again, something unreadable flickering behind his composed expression. You are very precise, he said, almost as an afterthought. Naomi set the bottle down gently, her hand steady, her voice calm when she spoke. Details matter, she replied. 2 words. Simple, but they landed differently this time. Not as service, not as politeness, but as something else entirely. Something closer to truth. Ethan held her gaze for a second longer than before, then leaned back again, dismissing it once more, returning to his conversation as if nothing had shifted. But something had, because while he continued to speak about acquisition, about control, about making this place his, he had just been reminded, in the quietest way possible, that some things were never his to begin with. And Naomi Brooks, standing just inches from the table he believed he owned, was about to make that reality impossible to ignore. The air around the table tightened, not with noise, but with the kind of silence that builds before something shifts for good. Ethan continued speaking, his tone confident, his words flowing into projections and timelines as if the outcome had already been signed, sealed, and secured. We move fast, he said, tapping the edge of the table lightly with one finger. That is why we win. While others hesitate, we take control. His associates nodded again, more firmly this time, their agreement feeding his certainty. One of them leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel exclusive. So once ownership transfers, we can begin restructuring immediately? Ethan did not hesitate. Immediately, he replied. New leadership, new direction. We elevate the brand. The word elevate lingered in the air, polished and confident, but underneath it carried something else. Something dismissive, as if what existed now was not enough. Naomi stood still for a moment longer than usual, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, but her presence now impossible to ignore for anyone paying attention. She was no longer just part of the background. She was part of the moment. And somewhere deep in the rhythm of the evening, the balance had shifted again. At the bar, Daniel felt it before he saw it. A subtle change in Naomi's stance. Not physical, not obvious, but intentional. He straightened instinctively, his hands resting against the polished surface, his gaze fixed on the table that had become the center of something far larger than a business deal. Because he knew what was coming. Not the exact words, not the exact moment, but the direction. And once it began, there would be no stepping back. Naomi stepped forward again, her movements precise, deliberate, every step measured as if placed on a line only she could see. She reached for the empty glass in front of Ethan, replacing it with a fresh one without being asked. The motion was smooth, effortless, practiced. But this time, she did not step away immediately. This time, she stayed. Just for a second longer than necessary. Just enough to change the rhythm. Ethan noticed. Not because he was looking for it, but because it disrupted something he could not quite define. He glanced up, meeting her gaze again, and for the first time. That night, there was a flicker of something different behind his expression. Not recognition. Not yet. But awareness. Is there something you need? He asked, his tone neutral, but edged with the kind of authority that expected an answer. Naomi held his gaze, calm, steady, unhurried. No, she said softly. Then, after a brief pause that seemed to stretch longer than it should, she added, but there might be something you should know. The words did not rise. They did not demand attention, but they carried weight. Enough to slow the table. Enough to pull the focus away from contracts and numbers and place it squarely on her. Ethan's associates exchanged brief glances, unsure whether to dismiss or engage. Ethan leaned back slightly, studying her now, not as background, not as service, but as something that had stepped into his line of control. And what would that be? He asked. Naomi did not answer immediately. She turned her head slightly, her eyes moving across the room for just a moment before settling again. Daniel was already moving. Not fast, not rushed, but with purpose. He approached the table, his posture composed, his expression carefully neutral, but his presence unmistakable. The shift was immediate. Conversations at nearby tables softened again. Attention narrowed. Because when management steps in unprompted, something has already begun. Daniel stopped beside Naomi, not in front of her, not over her, but beside her. Equal. Intentional. He cleared his throat lightly, his voice calm, but carrying just enough to be heard. Mr. Caldwell, he began. There is a detail regarding this establishment that may not have been included in your briefing. Ethan's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, the faintest crease forming between his brows. He did not like interruptions. He did not like unknowns. And that is, he asked, his tone controlled, but no longer relaxed. Daniel glanced at Naomi for the briefest second, then back at Ethan. Ownership structure, he said. 2 words. Simple. But the effect was immediate. Because for the first time that night, the conversation was no longer about what Ethan planned to take. It was about what he had never understood in the first place. And Naomi Brooks, standing quietly at his side, was no longer just part of the room. She was about to redefine it. For a moment, nothing moved. Not the glasses, not the hands resting on the table, not even the quiet hum of the city beyond the windows. The words, ownership structure, did not sound dramatic, did not sound threatening, but in a room built on control and certainty, they carried a weight that did not belong to the surface of the conversation. Ethan's fingers, which had been resting so confidently against the table, stilled. His gaze shifted from Daniel to Naomi, then back again, as if recalculating something that should have already been clear. I am aware of the ownership structure, he said, his tone measured, but tighter now, less fluid than before. We have done our due diligence. Daniel did not immediately respond. He stood calmly, his posture composed, but there was no hesitation in his presence. With respect, he said evenly, there may be a detail that was overlooked. The phrasing was careful, professional, but it did not soften the impact. Around the table, the energy shifted again, this time more visibly. One of the associates straightened in his seat, another closed his folder halfway, as if instinctively preparing for something unexpected. Because in rooms like this, overlooked details were not small things. They were risks. And risk, especially unaccounted risk, had a way of changing everything. Ethan leaned back slightly, his jaw tightening just enough to be noticed by those paying attention. Then clarify it, he said. Not a request. A directive. Daniel turned his head slightly toward Naomi, not to prompt her, not to signal her, but to acknowledge what was already understood between them. Naomi stepped forward, her movement quiet, deliberate, her presence now fully within the center of the table's attention. No longer background. no longer invisible. Just there. Exactly where she needed to be. She did not rush. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her gaze steady as it met Ethan's. "The ownership you are referring to," she began, her voice calm, clear, unshaken, "is not structured the way you think it is." The sentence was simple, direct, but it landed harder than any raised tone could have. Ethan's expression did not change immediately, but something behind his eyes shifted, a flicker of calculation, of resistance, of disbelief beginning to form. "Explain," he said. One word. Controlled, but no longer relaxed. Naomi held his gaze for a moment, not challenging, not defensive, just present. Then she continued. "This restaurant is not solely owned by the individuals listed in your report," she said. "There is a silent partner." The words settled into the space between them, quiet but undeniable. One of the associates let out a small breath, almost a laugh, as if trying to dismiss the tension. "That is not unusual," he said quickly. "We can negotiate with additional stakeholders." Naomi did not look at him. Her attention remained on Ethan. Because this was not about additional stakeholders. This was about something else entirely. Ethan's fingers tapped once against the table again, a subtle return of movement. But this time, it was not confidence. It was control trying to re-establish itself. "Then we include them," he said. "It does not change the outcome." Naomi's expression did not shift, not even slightly, because now, the moment had arrived. Not the insult, not the silence, not the tension. The point where assumption meets reality. "It does," she said softly. 2 words. Enough to stop the rhythm again. Enough to pull every ounce of attention back to her. Ethan's gaze sharpened, his focus narrowing completely now, no longer divided between deals and projections. "And why is that?" he asked. Naomi let a brief silence settle, just long enough to make the answer feel inevitable. Then she spoke. "Because you have already spoken to her," she said. The room stilled again, but this time it was different. Not confusion, not discomfort. Something closer to realization, hovering just beneath the surface, waiting to be named. Ethan's brow tightened slightly, his mind moving quickly now, replaying the evening, the interactions, the details he had dismissed as irrelevant. And for the first time that night, uncertainty entered the space he had believed he controlled completely. Naomi did not move. She did not step back. She did not look away, because she knew exactly what came next, and she was ready for it. The silence did not break all at once. It fractured slowly, like glass under pressure, each second stretching thinner as realization began to take shape in the space between them. Ethan did not speak immediately. He could not. His mind was moving too fast now, replaying every interaction, every moment he had dismissed as insignificant. The way she moved, the way she did not react, the way she stayed, always present, always composed. And then the words came back to him, clear and undeniable. "You have already spoken to her." His gaze sharpened, locking onto Naomi with a level of focus that had not existed before. Not as staff, not as background, but as a variable he had failed to account for. "That is not possible," he said finally, his voice controlled but carrying the first trace of strain. It was not anger. Not yet. It was something deeper. The discomfort of a man realizing the ground beneath him might not be as solid as he believed. Naomi did not respond right away. She let the silence sit, not to challenge him, not to embarrass him, but because the truth did not need urgency. It only needed space. Around the table, the associates were no longer pretending to understand. They were watching, fully engaged now, their earlier confidence replaced with careful attention. Because something had shifted beyond negotiation. This was no longer about numbers. It was about reality. Daniel remained still beside her, his presence steady, his role complete. He did not need to speak again. The moment no longer belonged to him. Naomi took a small step forward, not closing the distance aggressively, but enough to make it clear that she was no longer positioned outside the conversation. She was inside it. "You asked about precision," she said calmly, her voice even, almost reflective. "About details." Ethan did not interrupt. He could not, because now, every word mattered in a way it had not before. "This place runs on details," she continued. "Who shows up? Who listens? Who assumes?" Her gaze did not waver. Not once. "And who does not look closely enough?" The words were not sharp. They were not accusatory. But they carried a weight that settled deeper than anything said earlier that night. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, his posture shifting, not collapsing, not retreating, but adjusting. Because for the first time, he was no longer leading the conversation. He was following it. "If you are suggesting what I think you are suggesting," he said slowly, "then you should say it clearly." It was a challenge, but not the kind he was used to giving. This one was different. This one carried uncertainty beneath its surface. Naomi nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. Then she spoke, her voice steady, unshaken, impossible to misinterpret. "I am the silent partner." The words did not echo. They did not need to. They landed exactly where they were meant to. Direct, final, unavoidable. No one moved. No one spoke. The room did not react outwardly, but something inside it shifted completely. Because the line between power and perception had just been erased. Ethan did not look away. He could not. His eyes remained on hers, searching, measuring, recalculating everything he thought he understood. The uniform, the posture, the silence. It all rearranged itself in his mind, forming a picture he had not allowed himself to see. One of the associates leaned back slowly, his earlier confidence gone, replaced by something closer to disbelief. Another closed his folder entirely, the deal inside it suddenly uncertain. Because ownership was no longer theoretical. It was standing right in front of them, and it had been there all along. Naomi did not move. She did not step back. She did not raise her voice or change her tone, because she did not need to prove anything. She only needed to reveal it. Ethan exhaled slowly, a controlled breath, but one that carried more weight than any words he had spoken that night. "You expect me to believe that?" he asked, but the question was weaker than he intended. Not because it lacked force, but because it lacked certainty. Naomi held his gaze, calm, grounded, unwavering. "You already do," she said softly. And in that moment, the room understood something Ethan Caldwell had not planned for, could not negotiate, and could not control. The most important detail of the night had never been hidden. It had simply been ignored. The words did not fade. They settled, heavy, permanent. And for the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell had nothing immediate to replace them with. No strategy, no polished response, no confident redirection, just silence. Not the kind he used as a tool, but the kind that arrives when control slips just enough to be felt. His gaze remained fixed on Naomi, but now it was different. Not dismissive, not casual. It was searching, measuring, trying to reconcile two realities that refused to fit together. The uniform in front of him, the authority behind the words. Around the table, the shift was undeniable now. One associate leaned back slowly, exhaling through his nose, as if releasing tension he had not realized he was holding. Another glanced toward Daniel, then back at Naomi, as if silently confirming what had just been said without asking the question out loud. Because the truth did not need confirmation. It was already changing the room. Ethan straightened slightly, his posture recalibrating, not collapsing, but adjusting to something unfamiliar. "If that is true," he said carefully, each word chosen with precision now, "then it should have been disclosed during negotiations." It sounded like control. It sounded like structure. But underneath it, there was something else. A need to regain footing. Naomi did not react to the statement. She did not rush to justify or defend. She simply stood there, steady, composed, as if the conversation was unfolding exactly as she expected. "It was not required," she replied calmly. "Because you were not negotiating with me." The distinction landed clean, sharp in its simplicity. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly again, but this time he did not push back immediately. Because he understood the implication. He had not been speaking to the person who held the power he wanted. He had been speaking around her, past her, without ever seeing her. The realization did not come all at once, but it was there now, forming piece by piece. Every moment, every word, every assumption. At a nearby table, someone quietly set down their glass, the faint sound cutting through the tension like a reminder that the rest of the world was still moving. But at this table, time had narrowed, focused, because this was no longer about acquisition. It was about exposure. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his hands coming together on the table, his fingers interlacing, a subtle shift from dominance to consideration. "Then let us correct that," he said, his tone steadier now, but different, less certain, more calculated. If you are the decision maker, then we can discuss terms directly. It was a pivot, a controlled one, the kind he had used 1,000 times before to regain ground. But this time, it did not land the same way. Naomi watched him for a moment, her expression unchanged, her gaze steady. Then she shook her head once. Not abruptly, not dismissively, just enough to be clear. "There are no terms to discuss," she said softly. The words were quiet, but they carried finality. One of the associates shifted in his seat, his confidence slipping into unease. "Everyone has terms," he said, trying to reintroduce logic into a moment that was no longer operating on it. Naomi did not look at him. She kept her attention on Ethan, because this was not a group conversation anymore. "You said something earlier," she continued, her voice even, reflective, "about people understanding their place." Ethan's expression tightened again, just slightly, as the memory returned. Not because he had forgotten, but because now it sounded different. Now it carried consequence. Naomi took a small breath, not to steady herself, but to give the moment space. "This place was built on people who were overlooked," she said. "People who were underestimated. People who were told they did not belong in rooms like this." Her eyes did not leave his. Not for a second. "So no," she added quietly. "There are no terms for you to take it." The sentence did not rise. It did not need emphasis. It stood on its own, complete. And in that moment, something shifted again. Not just in the room, but in Ethan. Because for the first time that night, he was not thinking about the deal. He was thinking about the mistake. Not the kind that costs money. The kind that costs position, perception, authority. He leaned back slowly, his breath controlled, his expression composed once more, but no longer untouched. Because now, he understood something he had not considered when he walked into the room. Some things cannot be bought, not because they are too expensive, but because they were never for sale. And Naomi Brooks, standing across from him, had just made that truth impossible to negotiate. The room did not return to what it had been. It could not. Something too fundamental had shifted, something that could not be smoothed over with polite smiles or redirected with business language. The deal was no longer alive in the way it had been 30 minutes ago. It lingered, technically present, but hollow, stripped of the certainty that once drove it forward. Ethan sat back in his chair, his posture still composed, his expression still controlled, but no longer untouched. The confidence that had filled his voice earlier had been replaced with something quieter. Not weakness, not defeat, something closer to recognition. Around him, his associates remained still, their earlier energy replaced with careful silence, as if they were waiting for him to define what this moment meant. But Ethan did not speak right away, because for the first time that night, speaking too quickly would reveal more than it would protect. His gaze moved briefly across the table, then back to Naomi, who had not moved, had not shifted, had not needed to. She stood exactly where she had been, calm, steady, grounded in a position that had never changed, even when no one in the room had recognized it. And that, more than anything else, settled something in him. Not comfortably, but clearly. "I made an assumption," he said finally, his voice even, measured, but stripped of its earlier edge. It was not an apology. Not yet. But it was closer than anything he had offered before. Naomi did not interrupt. She did not react. She simply listened, giving the words the same space she had given everything else that night. Ethan exhaled slowly, his hands resting. Flat against the table now, no longer tapping, no longer signaling control. "And I was wrong," he added. The admission did not come easily, but it came clean. No qualifiers. No deflection. Just truth. One of the associates shifted slightly, as if unsure how to respond to a moment they had never seen from him before. Because men like Ethan Caldwell did not say that. Not publicly. Not in rooms like this. Naomi's expression softened, not in victory, not in satisfaction, but in understanding. Because this was not about proving him wrong. It was about revealing what had always been there. "It happens," she said quietly. Simple. Not dismissive. Not heavy. Just honest. Ethan let out a small breath, something almost like a restrained laugh, though it carried no humor. "Not like this," he said. And for a moment, the two of them stood in a space that was no longer defined by power or position, but by something else entirely. Clarity. The kind that arrives only when illusion is gone. Ethan straightened slightly, his posture settling into something more grounded, less performative. You built something here, he said, glancing briefly around the restaurant, taking it in not as an asset, not as a target, but as a reality. And I walked in thinking it was mine to take. Naomi followed his gaze for a moment, the soft light, the quiet movement of the staff, the rhythm of a place that had been carefully shaped over time. You walked in thinking you understood it, she replied. That is different. The distinction lingered, quiet but precise. Ethan nodded once, slowly, absorbing it without argument. Because now, there was nothing left to argue. The truth had already settled. The deal, the numbers, the strategy, all of it had become secondary to something far more important. The way he had seen her. Or rather, the way he had not. He reached for his glass, then paused, his hand hovering just above it before pulling back. A small gesture, but deliberate. There will be no further discussion about acquisition, he said, his voice steady, final. Not a negotiation. A decision. His associates exchanged brief glances, but none of them spoke. Because they understood what he had just done. Not just walking away from a deal, but acknowledging a boundary he had not recognized before. Naomi gave a slight nod, not as approval, not as permission, but as acknowledgement. That was all that was needed. The moment did not require anything more. No applause, no reaction, just acceptance. Ethan stood, adjusting his jacket slightly, his movements composed but no longer driven by the same certainty. He looked at Naomi one last time, his gaze steady, no longer searching, no longer dismissing, just seeing. Thank you, he said. 2 words. Simple, but earned. Naomi met his gaze, her expression calm, her voice quiet when she responded. For what? Ethan paused for a brief second, then answered. For the detail I almost missed. And with that, he turned, his associates following, their earlier confidence replaced with a different kind of silence as they moved toward the exit. The door closed behind them without sound, the city lights still glowing beyond the glass, unchanged, indifferent to what had just taken place inside. Naomi remained where she was for a moment longer, then turned back toward the rhythm of the restaurant, picking up her tray, adjusting a glass, stepping seamlessly back into motion. Because for her, nothing had changed. Not really. She had not risen. She had not transformed. She had simply been seen. And sometimes, that is the only shift that matters. Power does not always announce itself. Sometimes, it stands quietly in the room, waiting for someone else to realize they were never the one holding it.